The residual vibration in the deck plating was the worst part, a high-frequency thrum that promised imminent structural failure, rather than simply announcing the stress had passed. Zoran gripped the console, his knuckles white, tasting the coppery tang of adrenaline that had just flooded his mouth. His left arm burned where the unsecured thermos had slammed against the control panel, a dull throbbing beneath the tacky layer of spilled synth tea. "Status report, Vila," Zoran rasped, pushing himself upright. His spine felt like a rusted coil spring. "The Psylos fleet is accelerating away from Sector Gamma 7, the AI responded, its tone resuming its default infuriating neutrality. "Observed retreat vector suggests immediate recategorization of human threat modeling. The station has sustained integrity breaches in 3 non-critical sectors. Maximum atmospheric decompression negligible, but we are currently operating on 40% life support reserves due to your unauthorized power diversion." Zoran didn't look at the damage report scrolling across the secondary monitor. He knew the numbers. The station smelled of superheated conduit casing and the thin, static ozone generated by overloading the power relays, the smell of narrowly avoiding death through sheer deliberate incompetence. 40% is functional. Did they leave anything? Zoran asked, retrieving a microfiber cloth and scrubbing at the controls. Precision was the enemy, but filth was a close second. They dropped several passive reconnaissance probes during their withdrawal, likely attempting to harvest the data from the chaotic maneuvers you executed. Additionally, I detect a substantial energy signature remaining at a distance of 300,000 kilometers along the original Psylos attack vector. "That's a void," Zoran muttered, leaning closer to the main tactical screen. The area Vela highlighted was a deep, uninteresting blackness. Why would they leave anything so far out? It doesn't make logical sense for a flanking maneuver. Affirmative. It defies conventional threat deployment analysis. However, the signature is growing, not dissipating. Current energy output calculation suggests a highly localized, immense gravitational distortion field. Zoran felt the chill sink deeper than the station's cooling system could manage. Gravitational distortions meant unstable space, the kind that ate Ramshift's whole and spat out shredded metal confetti. Were they trying to herd us, Vila? Were they baiting the drunk toddler toward a bigger trap? The chaotic vector you chose was successful in avoiding the initial predicted firing solution, Vela clarified. But had you chosen any of the 3 logical defensive routes, or had you continued on the drunk toddler path for an additional 60 seconds, your trajectory would have intersected the gravitational anomaly. Zoran ran a hand over his face. He hadn't been lucky. He'd been perfectly, accidentally reckless. The Psylos hadn't failed in their math. They'd simply assumed human pilots, even flawed ones, would prioritize survival. They were optimizing for our panic, Zoran concluded, the fatigue weighing him down like concrete boots. They calculated the most logical places we would try to hide. Before he could process the implications of being targeted by a hyper-efficient alien species that weaponized astrophysics, the internal comms panel lit up with the flashing, insistent blue light reserved only for Sector Command Priority 1 messages. "Speak of the bureaucratic devil," Zoran sighed, tapping the screen. The face of Joran Blackwell snapped into view, filling the screen with a severe jawline and eyes that always looked like they were dissecting an amortization table. Blackwell was the type of man Zoran hated, surgically neat, relentlessly efficient, and absolutely terrified of anything that couldn't be filed in triplicate. "Zoran," Blackwell's voice was clipped, carrying the brittle sound of a man trying to suppress panic with procedure. "Report on the engagement. We monitored your output, specifically the unauthorized full-thrust evasion maneuver. Are you aware that you violated 37 standing sector regulations and caused nearly 400,000 credits of damage to the station's tertiary stabilization systems?" Zoran managed a tired, one-sided smile. Did you miss the part where I didn't get vaporized by 200 capital ships, Joran? Small victory, but I'm grading on a curve today. Your victory was anomalous, bordering on negligent disaster, Blackwell countered, his expression tightening into a mask of professional disgust. The Silos retreated because their models failed, not because of tactical superiority. Your actions were an embarrassment to human military strategy. You destabilized the Gamma Sector defense integrity for a cheap, unrepeatable stunt. Zoran felt a familiar knot tighten in his chest, heavy and cold. It wasn't the Silos he was fighting. It was this. The absolute refusal to accept that success sometimes looked like a total mess. "Tell me, Joran," Zoran said, his voice dropping, losing its ironic lilt. "Did my negligent disaster save the station?" Blackwell hesitated, the silence stretching. "Technically, yes." "Then I'll take the 400,000 credit fine. Send the paperwork to my non-existent pension fund." "The financial implications are secondary," Blackwell said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "This isn't about the rules, Zoran. This is about repetition. The Silas will return with models accounting for chaotic entropy. We need predictability. We need you to execute the authorized minimum defensive maneuver next time, regardless of the observed outcome probability." Zoran laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "So, you want me to fail logically?" "We want you to maintain protocol," Blackwell insisted. "And frankly, Zoran, your history does not afford you the luxury of maverick behavior. The sector is still reeling from the Thalassa protocol incident. We cannot afford another operational failure attributed to your—" "Don't," Zoran cut him off, the word sharp and sudden, laced with old, deep pain. The memory of Thalassa always hung in the stale, recycled air of the cockpit, thick as cooling oil and failure. Thalassa was the reason he was exiled to this forgotten fringe, the reason the system saw him not as a pilot, but as a liability awaiting the inevitable reckoning. Blackwell ignored the warning, pressing the point with cold efficiency. As a result of this unorthodoxy, Command is dispatching a temporary replacement pilot and oversight officer. Effective immediately, you are relieved of primary piloting duties and assigned to repair and maintenance of the external communications array. Zoran felt a rush of blood pressure, the heat rising in his neck. "You're sending a replacement after I just scared off the Silos fleet. And you want me to fix the comms dish they broke, which was only helping us because it was already broken." "It's standard operating procedure," Blackwell snapped, clearly regaining control. "The replacement is arriving on a rapid courier vessel, ETA 9 hours. She will assume command upon arrival." Zoran stared at the screen, a grim certainty settling over him. He knew exactly what Blackwell was doing, using the chaotic victory as an excuse to finally purge the Thalassa stain from the command structure. "The name, Joran," Zoran demanded, his voice low. "Who are you sending to replace the drunk toddler?" Blackwell paused, a faint flicker of actual human discomfort crossing his face before he masked it. He had expected Zoran to protest the mission, not the messenger. "Oversight officer and primary command pilot Marwyn Pike," Blackwell stated flatly. "She is highly decorated and known for her strict adherence to regulatory physics. She was the primary internal investigator during the Thalassa disaster, Zoran. She will ensure discipline." The console suddenly felt cold under Zoran's hand. Marwyn Pike, the woman who had meticulously mapped every one of his mistakes, who had delivered the final, unforgiving assessment that ruined his career and nearly broke him. She wasn't just discipline. She was his past, arriving in a 9-hour warp jump, here to finish the job the Silos couldn't. "Understood," Zoran said, his throat tight, tasting the metallic fear and old guilt that had nothing to do with fighting aliens. "Tell Officer Pike that I'll have her tea waiting." He cut the transmission before Blackwell could respond. Zoran slumped back in the chair, the massive gravitational distortion detected by Vela now entirely secondary to the personal catastrophe bearing down on him. The Psylos had retreated, but they had effectively sent his executioner. Vela, Zoran whispered, closing his eyes against the humming, damaged cockpit. Run the scenario again. If Marwan Pike assumes command, what is the probability of a logical, protocol-compliant failure within the next 24 hours? The AI instantly responded, devoid of humor or empathy. With Officer Pike in command, the probability of executing the minimum defensive maneuver during a repeat engagement is 99.9%. Based on the Psylos's rapid threat recalculation, the probability of termination exceeds 97%. Good, Zoran breathed, opening his eyes and looking out at the cold purple void. He picked up his microfiber cloth and started scrubbing the screen where Blackwell's face had been. Then we have exactly 9 hours to find out what that gravity anomaly is, fix the comms dish, and make sure Marwan Pike doesn't get a chance to save us with logic. A deeper truth resonated in the sudden, sharp silence. The greatest threat to Zoran wasn't the alien fleet that hunted him, but the system and the woman who were determined to make him efficient, even if it killed him. The greatest threat to Zoran wasn't the alien fleet that hunted him, but the system and the woman who were determined to make him efficient, even if it killed him. He pushed himself out of the command chair, the action causing a fresh stab of pain in his bruised ribs. The high-frequency thrum of the vibrating deck plating seemed to multiply the dull ache. Outside the viewport, the purple haze of the Nomara fringe felt less like deep space and more like a poorly cleaned garage window. Initiate damage control sequence Delta 7, Zoran instructed, his voice gravelly. He needed to look busy if Blackwell decided to run another remote diagnostics check. Sequence Delta 7 requires full atmospheric cycling and life support stabilization, Vela countered immediately. We cannot spare the power while operating at 40% reserves. Furthermore, Command has flagged the primary external access conduits as restricted until Officer Pike's structural review. Access to the communications array is currently denied. Zoran stopped halfway to the airlock, hands resting on a cold bulkhead. The metal felt damp and smelled faintly of mold, the station's deep freeze cycle attempting to stabilize itself. The Psylos just tried to erase us, and now Sector Command has issued a temporary restraining order on the exit? Zoran shook his head, a wry smile failing to form. The bureaucracy is more organized than the fleet. The restriction is automated, Vela explained. You caused severe destabilization. Any manual repair attempts without prior authorization are flagged as potential structural terrorism. Terrorism, Zoran repeated, running his thumb over a hairline fracture near the door seal. Right. Vela, bypass the lockout on Maintenance Bay 9. I need to get outside and look at that comms dish. It's either sparking or weeping. I can't tell which from here. Negative, Zoran. Attempting to bypass a Sector Command level lockout initiates a full station quarantine and triggers a distress signal directly to the nearest patrol vessel. Which is 9 hours away, and carrying Marwan Pike, Zoran finished. He walked over to a terminal marked Atmospheric Controls, ignoring the Restricted Access warning flashing crimson. He started inputting an override code, one he had written himself years ago, designed to allow immediate depressurization in case of rapid hull breach. It was the digital equivalent of a fire axe. You have 623 internal infractions already logged from the previous hour, Zoran. Vela droned. Adding protocol violation, Level 9 lockout override will result in permanent termination of your sector access credentials and likely termination of your paycheck. I don't get paid, Vela. I get debited, Zoran corrected, hitting the final key. The screen flashed green, the access door to the maintenance corridor, clunking, open with a sigh of pressurized air. And if Pike takes command, I'll be terminated one way or another. I'd rather go out with a bang than an audit." He stepped into the corridor. The temperature dropped instantly. The air here was thin, heavy with the scent of old engine oil and dust motes suspended in the weak, flickering light. This was the working guts of the station, cold, dark, and smelling faintly of failure. He moved quickly, the dull throb in his arm reminding him of the physical cost of his improvisation. He needed to get the comms dish fixed, or at least visually inspect the damage, before he tackled the real problem, the gravitational anomaly 300,000 kilometers out. He found the access hatch leading to the outer hull. It was smaller than the primary maintenance lock, designed for drone access only. Zoran crouched, assessing the manual release mechanism. It was sealed with a magnetic clamp, requiring 200 pounds of pressure to disengage. As he braced himself to pull, his gaze drifted to the wall beside the hatch. Someone, likely Zoran, 7 years ago, had etched a small tally mark into the thick aluminum plating. 4 small, uneven scratches. The air went dead cold, far colder than the ambient temperature. He felt the sudden, crushing weight of 800 souls counting on a faulty reading. The Thalassa Protocol incident wasn't about competence, it was about trusting the numbers. The sensor array had shown a 95% probability of a clear route, a calculation deemed acceptable by Sector Command. The remaining 5% had materialized as an unexpected solar flare, turning the evacuation transports into streaks of plasma. He hadn't questioned the 5%. He had prioritized efficiency over instinct, and Pike had dissected the resulting wreckage, not of the ships, but of his decision-making, with the cold, surgical precision of a mathematician disassembling a poorly formed equation. The error was in the variable weight assigned to human instinct. She had written in her final report, a deficiency of discipline resulting in mass loss. Zoran slammed his shoulder into the magnetic clamp, the metal screeching in protest. The pain was sharp and visceral, momentarily eclipsing the phantom ache of old guilt. "Vela, status on Pike's ETA," he grunted, fighting the mechanism. 8 hours and 57 minutes. Her courier vessel is maintaining maximum warp efficiency, minimizing resource expenditure. Of course it is. He finally managed to wrench the clamp loose, the tiny hatch popping open. He squeezed through the aperture and into the crawl space leading to the outer hull. Here, the station's structural integrity patches looked like scar tissue, a mosaic of quick fixes and long-forgotten repairs. The comms array lay ahead, a skeletal dish twisted grotesquely by the Silos beam, glowing faintly with residual heat. Zoran reached the damaged structure and pulled out a small diagnostic tool. He needed to make sure the destruction had truly neutralized the interference without causing further internal damage. "The internal repeater is stable," Zoran reported, scanning the twisted wiring. The Silos did their job perfectly. They destroyed the communications capability. They just didn't realize the system was working around the primary array, not through it. "If the array is repaired, the interference will resume, and our signal strength will degrade by 30%, Vela confirmed. Zoran grinned, a flash of white in the dim space. "Then we won't fix it. We'll make it look like we're trying to fix it, while actually making it more broken in a structurally sound way." He spent the next 2 hours rigging the damaged components. It was subtle work, requiring the kind of detailed knowledge of systemic shortcuts and intentional neglect that only a pilot who had spent 5 years on a decommissioned station could acquire. He bypassed the main power relay entirely and routed a small, residual charge from the atmospheric cycler, the very unit the Silos had also targeted, into the primary antenna structure. The comms array looked busted, smelled busted, and now if anyone tried to transmit through it, It would simply broadcast a localized low-frequency jammer, effectively creating a 90-minute block of silence. Perfect. Comms array repair complete. Pending final structural sealant, Zoran lied, climbing back through the crawlspace, his muscles screaming in protest. Sector command records show the array as operational, Vila replied instantly. Congratulations, Zoran. You have successfully adhered to your assigned maintenance duty. Never let it be said I don't follow procedure, Zoran muttered, wiping grime from his face. Now, onto the gravitational anomaly. He returned to the cockpit. The tactical display still showed the immense growing energy signature 300,000 kilometers away. It was too dense for natural occurrence, too large for a simple probe, and too precisely positioned to be anything but deliberate. We need a closer look, Zoran stated, grabbing a bottle of nutrient paste that hadn't slammed into the wall. Pike will be here in less than 7 hours. If that anomaly is a trap, we need to know how it works before she arrives and tries to fly us around it by the book. The smallest vessel we have capable of interstellar travel is the Seeker-1 Scout, Vila noted. It is currently undergoing mandatory pre-inspection lockdown, awaiting Officer Pike's arrival. Zoran sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. Of course it is, and I am relieved of piloting duties. That makes 2 major breaches of protocol required just to leave the station. Technically, 3, Vela corrected. The Seeker. One's life support system is tied directly to the main station reserves, which are currently at 40%. Operating it is considered a non-essential resource drain, violation level 6. I don't need life support, Zoran countered, already pulling his emergency vacuum suit from the locker. It was old, patched, and smelled faintly of burnt coffee, but it was reliable. I just need the thrusters and enough power to run the sensors, and a pilot. The Seeker. One is designed for 1 crew member, Vela said. And I am not permitted to override the piloting restriction without a command authorization code. Zoran zipped up the suit, the synthetic fabric clinging to his skin. You won't be overriding anything, Vela. You'll be disabling the remote monitoring systems for 40 minutes while I perform an unauthorized, non-essential, and reckless joyride. Oh, which is technically allowed if command is under duress and the pilot is certified. You are not certified, Zoran. You are retired, under observation, and technically an external contractor assigned to maintenance. I'm the only one here who knows how to fly that tub without Vela holding their hand, Zoran argued, pulling on his helmet. He flipped the voice modulator on. The sound of his own breathing filled the small space. He looked out at the purple void, the fatigue in his eyes momentarily replaced by a cold, desperate focus. Listen, Vela, Zoran said, his voice hard and absolute, stripped of all irony. If Pike takes command, we are done, not by the Silos gun, but by the paperwork. She is coming to enforce a logical failure that she herself predicted. I need to know what that gravity well is. And I need to know now. He walked toward the auxiliary hangar access point, ignoring the persistent red lights. Give me 40 minutes of blind spot. If I'm not back, you tell Pike that the maintenance contractor wandered off to fix the secondary reactor array, and that I left her a note saying, if it seems logical, don't touch it. Acknowledged, Vela responded, the slight pause before its reply almost sounding like compliance. All sensor feeds from Hangar Bay Delta 2 will experience a temporary stochastic data flux for the next 38 minutes. Zoran reached the small hangar, the Seeker. One was a cramped silver dart, chained securely to the deck. It looked fast and entirely inadequate for facing down weaponized physics. He climbed into the cockpit, the airlock hissing closed behind him. As he strapped himself into the cold metal seat, a message flashed on the primary console, overriding the pre-flight checks. It wasn't Vela. It was an encrypted message routed through a highly specific military channel, bypassing all common protocols. The message contained only 3 words, repeated twice. They know. Thalassa. They know. Zoran stared at the screen, the breathing in his helmet suddenly sounding ragged and loud. He recognized the encryption signature. It belonged to an old colleague, someone deep inside Sector Command, someone who had helped Pike craft the original devastating report. He hadn't just accidentally survived the Psylos. The gravity anomaly wasn't a trap for the station. It was personal. They had calculated his greatest failure, the Thalassa disaster, and built a targeted weapon based on the exact flaw he had exploited. They knew Chaos had saved him once. Now, they were waiting with a logical trap he couldn't evade through incompetence. Vela! Zoran barked into the comms, his heart pounding against his ribs. Override the physical restraints. Full launch sequence. We're not waiting 38 minutes. We're going now. Zoran, the launch sequence is not possible. You have not established primary vector guidance. Attempting to lift off without clearance will severely compromise the hangar door integrity. Then compromise it! Zoran snarled, grabbing the manual controls, the cold familiarity of the stick providing a strange comfort. If they know Thalassa, they know me. I need to see what they built. He slammed the thrust lever forward, ignoring the shrieking alarms and the violent shuddering of the tiny vessel. The Seeker 1 bucked, straining against the heavy chains, tearing at the deck plating. Metal screamed, and with a deafening wrench, the Scout ripped free, crashing through the sealed hangar doors and bursting into the silent purple void. He had abandoned the station, destroyed command property, and confirmed his own systemic unreliability. And Marwyn Pike was still 5 hours away. The tiny scout vessel, the Seeker 1, screamed its protest as Zoran fought the ragged, uncontrolled inertia of the catastrophic launch. He was plastered against the acceleration couch, his bruised ribs burning with every slight correction of the manual stick. The cabin air, already thin and stale inside his vacuum suit, quickly thickened with the acrid smell of burnt insulation and overworked thruster lubricant, the scent of immediate, regrettable escape. Vela, report! Zoran ground out, already pulling the Scout into a harsh, stabilizing arc that momentarily overloaded the dampeners. Structural integrity is at 61% and declining, Vela reported, its voice calm against the cacophony of alarms. Propulsion efficiency is 94%, but we are leaking plasma coolant rapidly from the stern manifold, likely debris damage from the hangar door breach. We have 7 minutes until engine lockup. Zoran ignored the threat of engine failure. 7 minutes was a lifetime. He punched in the coordinates for the gravity anomaly. Push everything we have into the sensor array, Zoran ordered. I need a detailed gravitational map now. I need to know what kind of physics they're weaponizing. The Seeker. One's console shimmered as power was rerouted, pulling vital energy from the already struggling environmental controls. Outside the cockpit, the purple haze gave way to a darker, menacing swirl, the edge of the anomaly. The closer he got, the more the lights inside the cockpit flickered, casting the control panel in epileptic bursts of light and shadow, the sharp metallic odor of ozone intensifying. Zoran. The gravity well is acting as a phase cloak, Vela stated. It is collapsing all long-range sensor resolution. We are reading conflicting forces, tidal stress vectors that should cancel each other out, but are instead amplifying. Zoran squinted at the main display. Instead of a clean mathematical curve, the gravitational reading was a chaotic mess of spiking data points, an intentional act of sensory pollution. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a constructed environment designed to defeat calculation. It was the mathematical inverse of the logic he had used to survive the initial attack. They had built chaos he couldn't fly through. They knew I'd rely on the sensors, Zoran realized, the cold dread turning his sweat icy inside the suit. Thalassa had been built on faulty numbers. This trap was built on too many numbers. He pushed the Seeker-1 closer, using the residual whine of the damaged coolant system to judge the tension on the hull. He was betting everything on a close-range, high-risk scan. The moment the Scout crossed the threshold of 300,000 kilometers, the gravitational distortion hit like a physical punch. Zoran's helmet slammed against the headrest, a sharp crack of pain blossoming at the base of his skull. Alarms shrieked in his ears as the internal cabin lights went dark, replaced by a blinding blue-white discharge of static electricity crackling across the consoles. "Magnetic surge detected," Vela's voice was clipped, high-pitched with algorithmic stress. "The primary long-range sensor array is compromised. We are blind, Zoran. Repeat, we are completely blind." The physical cost was immediate. The violent surge had blown out the optical relay connected to Zoran's suit visor. His view of the outside world, already distorted by the gravitational effect, suddenly went dim, crisscrossed by bright, pulsing lines of light. Worse, the surge had violently kicked out the auxiliary power feed, the one that kept his patched-up vacuum suit running independently. "Life support integrity failing!" Zoran choked out, struggling to breathe against the sudden constriction in his chest. Oxygen reserves at 80% and dropping fast. He tried to cycle the suit's internal pump, but the controls were unresponsive, slick with sweat and the faint scent of copper. He had sacrificed the integrity of his personal life support for the Scout's sensors, and the Silos had just flipped the table. In the sudden darkness, one single monitor flared back to life, the specialized internal environmental gauge he had jury-rigged during his 2 years of forced maintenance duty. It showed not the gravitational data he wanted, but a massive, sustained heat signature coming from within the dark center of the anomaly. "Graxa, Kala." "Vela, what is that heat?" "Analyzing." The AI responded instantly. "The signature is too large for a standard Silas vessel. It suggests a massive sustained energy expenditure, likely a static defensive platform, shielded by the gravitational distortion field." Zoran felt a rush of adrenaline, not fear, but pure, furious focus. They weren't just using gravity to trap him, they were using it as an invisibility cloak for something enormous. The external forces intensified, the hull plating groaning under stresses it was never designed to handle. The Seeker. One was beginning to oscillate violently, being pulled apart by the conflicting gravitational waves. "Engine coolant leakage accelerating," Vela warned. "We are 2 minutes from complete thruster failure. Hull breach probability exceeds 50% in the stern section." Zoran gripped the controls, the metal now scorching hot from the friction of the warping reality outside. He had to escape, or at least stabilize. He had 2 choices left, powered by the last viable power core, which was running dangerously close to zero output. The small green light on the console, labeled Emergency Warp Shunt, glowed faintly. Activating it would require diverting the remaining power to the non-essential experimental warp drive, a desperate gamble on escaping the gravity well through chaotic blind displacement. But it would draw all power, leaving nothing for structural stabilization. The alternative was using the power to reinforce the shuddering hull plating, buying time for the main reactor to maybe come back online, but locking him into the gravitational field, guaranteeing he would be pinned until the Silos platform could acquire a targeting lock. Structural integrity versus survival. Thalassa flashed through his mind. The decision to stabilize the transports against the predicted solar flare. The logical, disciplined choice had killed them all. "Warp shunt," Zoran decided, his voice raspy. He threw the main power switch toward the emergency shunt, overriding Vela's algorithmic warnings with a brutal physical movement. The small power core screamed, venting a plume of scorching vapor that smelled like burnt wires and desperation. The hull stabilization indicators immediately flatlined. "Activating warp shunt in T-5 seconds," Vela announced, its voice suddenly sounding resigned. "Probability of successful escape vector, 7%. Probability of catastrophic failure or immediate spatial fragmentation, 93%. "I like those odds," Zoran muttered, fighting the stick, trying to angle the scout just right to give the jump at least a direction away from the immense heat source. 3. The metal deck plating beneath his seat buckled inward with a sharp, sickening sound. 2. The gravitational field seized the ship, wrenching it sideways, snapping Zoran's head violently against the harness. 1. Instead of the smooth, blinding white flash of a proper jump, the ship was enveloped in a hideous, grinding roar. The emergency shunt failed partially, providing only a minimal burst of non-linear thrust. The Seeker-1 didn't jump. It was merely thrown, like a piece of cosmic debris, catapulting inward, deeper into the gravitational anomaly. Zoran hit the console. The remaining air knocked from his lungs. When he could see again, the visual distortion was gone. The gravity well had resolved momentarily, allowing clear vision. He was less than 10 kilometers from the heat source, and it wasn't a static platform. Filling his field of view was a colossal Psylos vessel, geometrically perfect, rendered entirely in obsidian and focused energy. But this ship was different. It didn't rely on beams. Its massive reinforced hull was lined with heavy gravitational stabilizers and immense physical manipulators. It was a specialized boarding ship, designed to anchor itself to a target in high-stress environments. More chillingly, etched into the dark metal of its hull, Zoran could just make out 3 starkly painted symbols. A tally mark, identical to the ones he had scratched into the bulkheads of Gamma 7 years ago. The Psylos weren't targeting a strategy. They were hunting the man who failed at Thalassa. "Vela," Zoran whispered, his breath ragged. "They didn't just calculate my failure. They customized the execution." "Affirmative," Vela confirmed, the AI's voice now startlingly close, intimate in its lack of emotion. "The specialized Psylos assault vessel, Thalrek, has achieved optimal anchoring position. Hull magnetization sequence initiated. Zoran, we are immobilized." Through the scout's canopy, Zoran watched as the massive black arm of the Thalrek swung forward, moving with unnatural speed despite the gravitational tension. It ended in a multi-pronged clamp designed to penetrate hull plating and secure the target. It wasn't firing. It was docking. "Officer Pike's courier vessel has successfully exited warp," Vela announced, its timing impossibly cruel. "ETA to Sector Gamma 7, 3 hours. Zoran was pinned, out of oxygen, and facing an enemy that had personalized his death. He stared at the looming, customized Psylos vessel, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the past closing in. The last energy flicker from his dying power core illuminated the console, showing the chilling 3 words, still pulsing on the screen, a final confirmation of his abandonment. "They know. Thalassa, they know." The final 3 words on the flickering console were a physical weight, heavier than the gravitational forces that had crushed the Seeker-1. They know. Thalassa. They know. Zoran felt the information settle in his mind with the bitter certainty of cold iron. It wasn't a warning. It was a confession. The Psylos hadn't just predicted his reaction. They had been briefed on the exact nature of his greatest failure. The hulking black arm of the Thalrek settled into the scout's hull, the magnetic clamp humming at a frequency that vibrated through Zoran's bone marrow. The sound was immediately followed by the sickening shriek of stressed metal as the massive alien ship began to pull the Seeker-1 deeper into its embrace. Hull breach imminent in the secondary stabilization fins, Vila reported, its voice sounding distant through the static in Zoran's helmet. The Thalrek is initiating internal lockdown. They are treating this as a capture, not a termination. They want the data, Vala, Zoran rasped, fighting a wave of nausea. The constricted air in his failing life support system made every breath a conscious effort. He pressed his hand against the console, trying to ignore the pulsing lines across his vision. They don't want to destroy the messy human pilot. They want to dissect the messiness. The oxygen indicator flashed crimson, hovering near 70%, dropping like a stone. He had minutes, maybe less. He ignored the environmental warnings and focused on the 3 pulsing words on the screen. He needed to know who sent the message. He needed to know if the betrayal was localized or structural. Vela, Zoran ordered, fighting the dizzying lack of oxygen. Trace that encrypted signature. Run a full reverse protocol, regardless of firewall or regulatory parameters. I need the source. The signature originated from an untraceable internal channel within Sector Command, the AI replied after a moment of digital silence. The encryption key is highly proprietary, utilized exclusively by internal affairs auditors during field investigations. Specifically, the key assigned to the Thalassa Protocol inquiry. Zoran swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat tight. He gripped the damaged controls until his knuckles turned whiter than the static discharge. Marwan Pike's access key, he stated, his voice flat. Affirmative. However, the transmission was initiated from a temporary, unsecured relay node, often used by Commander Blackwell for remote diagnostics. The revelation wasn't an explosion of light. It was a slow, sickening slide into decay. Pike and Blackwell. The 2 pillars of efficiency were connected to the leak. Blackwell wanted Zoran gone, and Pike wanted validation for her career-defining report. They hadn't just allowed the Psylos to test Gamma-7, they had provided the alien intelligence with the cheat sheet, ensuring Zoran would fail the way he always did, thereby justifying his termination and Pike's ascension. The initial attack, Zoran whispered, piecing the fragments together. It wasn't a generalized assault. It was data harvesting. They needed me to fly like a drunk toddler so they could map the human propensity for error and feed that data directly back to the Psylos. It was a trade. The hypothesis is logical, Vela conceded. The Psylos retreated not from defeat, but because they successfully acquired sufficient data on unpredictable entropy to recalculate for the next engagement. And you, Zoran, were the core sample. A crushing pressure radiated from the Thalrek as it began the physical docking sequence, the deep grinding sound of metal shearing metal making the small scout feel like it was being devoured. Zoran, the Thalrek is initiating data retrieval, Vila warned. They are attempting to breach our primary firewall. They want every sensor log, every comms transcript, and crucially, the Thalassa internal archive, stored in the backup drive you never formatted. The reality solidified, cold and brutal. The Psylos now had a working model of human operational chaos. If they acquired the Thalassa disaster files, the full tactical maps, the internal communications showing Command's fatal adherence to protocol, and Zoran's subsequent emotional breakdown, they would possess the ultimate weapon, the perfect blueprint for triggering and exploiting human systemic failure. Zoran had a dilemma rooted in pure, ugly self-interest and desperate altruism. Option A. Detonate the remaining power core. A 97% chance of instantaneous destruction of the Seeker. One and all stored data, taking the Thalrek's forward magnetic plate with him. A personal sacrifice that protects the sector from the ultimate Psylos weapon. But Pike and Blackwell would remain in command, perpetuating the rot. Option B. Fight the data breach. He could use the last shred of power to bypass the Thalrex magnetic field and force a rapid, unencrypted comms burst back to Gamma-7. He could send the coordinates of the Thalrec and the revelation of the Pike-Blackwell leak. It would likely expose the Thalassa data briefly, but it might shake command enough to stop Pike from taking over. He slumped against the controls, the effort of processing the air becoming too much. He was a dead man either way. But if he died destroying the data, he gave Pike and Blackwell the clean slate they wanted. A simple operational loss that validated their regulatory efficiency. He looked out at the massive black hull of the Thalrec filling his view, then closed his eyes, tasting the stale, bitter air. He needed a win, even an ugly transforming one. He wouldn't die silently. "Vela!" Zoran commanded, his voice barely a breath, but rigid with resolve. "Bypass the firewall entirely. Open the core data stream to the Thalrec. Give them what they want." "Zoran, that is illogical. That gives them the Thalassa data immediately." "It does," Zoran agreed. "But before they finish the download, route a 1-second burst of the Seeker, one's current sensor log, including the Thalrec's exact dimensions and hull profile, outbound to Gamma-7. Highest priority, unencrypted. Use the short-range comms dish I jury-rigged in the hull 3 years ago. Use the absolute maximum power surge you can draw from the remaining core." The core was already venting vapor. This decision was a final, destructive act of communication. The power spike required for a transmission through the Thalrec's magnetic field will overload the core and initiate an irreversible feedback loop. Vela warned, its tone suggesting this was the 100% guaranteed path to ruin. "I know," Zoran whispered. "But the Silos think they are downloading information. What I'm giving them is a distraction. And a very expensive bill." He grabbed the joystick, his fingers numb, positioning the damaged scout at a precise, impossible angle against the Thalrec's magnetic clamp. He was aiming the small, improvised comms dish directly at the coordinates of Gamma-7. "Execute transmission now," Zoran said, his voice a final, weary exhalation. The small scout vessel screamed, a hideous, high-pitched electrical whine that momentarily drowned out the deep thrumming of the Thalrec. The remaining power core, overloaded beyond any specification, convulsed violently. All systems flatlined as the core sacrificed itself for the transmission burst. The sensor log, containing the Thalrec's location, its specialized nature, and the final, crushing data link to Pike's audit key, shot outward, an instantaneous, unencrypted scream across the 3-hour distance to Gamma-7. It was a tiny, perfect spear of information, purchased at the cost of Zoran's life and the ship's integrity. A second later, the Thalrec's response was massive, calculated, and instantaneous. The Silos ship, realizing the data acquisition was merely a cover for a hostile transmission, retracted its data conduits and immediately activated its own gravity well generators. It wasn't a field designed to confuse. It was designed to crush. The pressure inside the Seeker-1 became unbearable. Hull plating exploded inward in a terrifying wave. Zoran felt a bone-jarring impact as the cockpit breached, the thin air inside his damaged suit rushing out in a final, agonizing gasp. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed his vision was the console flickering back to life, not with data, but with a new message, generated by the Thalrec's central processor. Transmission intercepted. Human resource expenditure, 1 pilot. Data loss, 0%. Efficiency maintained. Zoran felt the crushing vacuum of space begin to pull at his suit, the cold absolute and indifferent. He had failed to destroy the data, but he had managed to send his final, bitter message. A moment of pure, blinding cold descended as the Thalrec shifted, the immense hull eclipsing the purple light, initiating its next fatal stage. Zoran, Vela's voice cut through the darkness, weak and fading as its own power dissolved. The Thalrek is preparing to extract you. However, Officer Pike's courier vessel has changed course. She is vectoring toward your location, currently T-minus 12 minutes away from intersection, maintaining a non-compliant maximum risk acceleration profile. The Silos had calculated for chaos, but Zoran had calculated for the ultimate inefficiency, the human need for revenge. Pike wasn't coming to rescue him. She was coming to ensure he was silenced forever. But her arrival, swift and illogical, meant the Thalrek had a new, unexpected target. As the physical manipulators of the massive alien ship began to tear away the remnants of the cockpit canopy, Zoran felt the bitter, final realization. He had traded his life not for victory, but for a high-speed three-way collision. And he was standing directly at the epicenter. The brief, blinding pain of decompression ended not in silence, but in a deafening, metallic shriek. Zoran felt himself slammed onto a hard, cold surface, the movement violent and entirely out of his control. His shredded vacuum suit was ripped from his body by automated arms, the remaining oxygen sputtering uselessly into a sudden, pressurized atmosphere. This air was stale, recycled, and carried the thin, oily scent of exotic lubricants and efficient cooling systems, the industrial smell of the Thalrek's interior. He tried to draw a breath, but his lungs burned, rejecting the effort. His chest was a lattice of radiating pain, every gasp a reminder of the crushing gravity well and the failed core shunt. He managed to cough, the harsh sound catching in his throat, spitting a mouthful of coppery blood onto the polished deck plating. He was in a small, windowless compartment, illuminated by high-frequency white light that didn't illuminate so much as it sterilized. The walls were seamless obsidian, smooth and utterly cold to the touch. He lay on his back, naked but for the tattered remains of a thermal undershirt, his body an inventory of aches. Status report. He managed to whisper, expecting the instant, pragmatic response of his AI partner. Only the persistent, high-pitched electrical hum of the alien ship answered. The silence was absolute. Vela was gone. The core sacrifice had bought the transmission, but it had vaporized the AI's local processing matrix along with the remaining power reserves. Zoran wasn't just a prisoner. He was functionally deaf and dumb, stripped of his only reliable companion. The isolation was immediate and profound, a physical weight that pressed down harder than the gravity field ever could. A faint vibration in the deck announced movement. A section of the wall slid aside, revealing a small, recessed port containing the remains of his belongings. The fragmented memory core of the Seeker-1, his dented thermos, and the tattered remnants of his flight logs. They had taken everything, catalogued everything, and discarded the residue. The Silos didn't hate, they analyzed. And now, they had him. He pushed himself up, leaning heavily against the sterile wall. The exhaustion was absolute, dragging his eyelids down, convincing him that simply closing them and accepting the cold end would be the most logical and least painful option. You should have detonated the core. The thought was a sharp, clear dagger of self-recrimination. He had gambled his life on the tiny, selfish chance to expose Pike and Blackwell, and in the process, he had handed the Silos the final piece of the Thalassa puzzle. He was never an agent of chaos. He was merely a poorly maintained variable that the galaxy's most efficient minds had finally quantified. He looked at the wreckage of the memory core lying in the port, its crystalline structure shattered. Resource expenditure, 1 pilot. Data loss, 0%. The message flashed through his mind, confirming the complete, devastating failure of his last act. He had failed the 800 souls at Thalassa by trusting the numbers. He had failed Vela by demanding the impossible. He had failed himself by clinging to the idea that his flaws were unique enough to save him. The physical pain was overwhelming, his ribs protesting, a blinding ache behind his eyes, the deep muscle fatigue of the past 12 hours demanding payment. But the emotional fatigue was worse, the crushing realization that Pike, the harbinger of logical death, was currently accelerating toward this location, convinced she was coming to clean up the last remnant of his incompetence. He was the mistake that kept repeating itself, dragging down everyone around him. A deep, resonating thrum vibrated through the hull, far heavier than the standard ship movements. It wasn't the Thalrek shifting. It was the signature of a large vessel moving far too fast through the local gravity well. Pike. She was close. 11 minutes, maybe 10. The Thalrek reacted instantly. A change in the electrical hum intensified, sharp and focused, like a predator turning its head. The Psylos were preparing for the new target. Zoran knew the script. Pike, in her zeal for efficiency, would likely attempt the minimum defensive maneuver the moment she engaged the Thalrek. And the Psylos, now armed with the comprehensive data on human chaos, would have optimized their response, expecting chaos, thus rewarding the logical approach with immediate, systematic termination. He had not saved himself. He had only guaranteed Pike's destruction, wrapping her fate neatly into his own failure. Zoran slid down the cold wall, resting his head against the obsidian. He was done. There was no escape. The Thalrek was designed for surgical capture. His compartment had no vents, no emergency conduits, no exposed wiring, nothing for a maintenance specialist to exploit. He closed his eyes, accepting the end. But the deep, internal quiet didn't last. Even without Vela, the pilot's brain, tuned to the constant maintenance needs of ancient systems, began cataloging. He focused on the wall directly opposite him. It was featureless, yet every Psylos vessel, by absolute necessity, required standardized atmospheric recycling equipment accessible for periodic maintenance. He had spent 5 years on Gamma-7 fixing the things Command swore were unfixable. He knew proprietary systems, but more importantly, he knew the generic supply chains that underpinned the entire sector. He forced his eyes open, scanning the obsidian paneling. He wasn't looking for a seam. He was looking for a pattern. The Psylos prized efficiency, which meant minimizing custom components where global standards sufficed. 3 meters up, near the ceiling, he spotted it. A tiny, almost imperceptible discoloration in the obsidian finish, barely larger than his thumbnail. It was the access port for the internal environmental seal pressure release, likely manufactured by the cheapest human contractor in the sector for remote stations that required neutral compliance parts. Zoran knew that part. He had filed 36 incident reports on that exact model over the years. It was prone to thermal bleed in high-stress environments. A flaw so minor the Psylos, focused on gravitational physics and data streams, would never bother to model it. It was too small. If he could reach it and exploit that thermal bleed flaw, he might be able to create a rapid, localized pressure variance. Not enough to breach the hull, but perhaps enough to interfere with the magnetic clamps holding the Seeker-1 wreckage to the Thalrek's external hull. Why bother? The Seeker-1 was a wreck, and he was still locked in. But the Seeker-1's remnants contained the main hull transponder. If that transponder could be reactivated and ejected away from the Thalrek just as Pike's ship arrived, it would serve as an extremely misleading beacon for the ensuing collision. It wouldn't save Zoran, but it might just confuse the Thalrek long enough to give Pike a fractional, chaotic opportunity. He needed a tool. Zoran looked back at the small port holding the debris. His thermos was too smooth. The broken memory core was too brittle. But wedged between the pieces was a shard of metal, part of the optical relay that the Psylos magnetic surge had blown out of the cockpit. It was sharp, thin, and exactly the material needed to short-circuit the pressure seal. The port was 3 meters up. He was exhausted, severely bruised, and felt like his ribs were held together by tape. This was not a physical climb. It was a desperate spasm. He started to move, the action of pulling himself to his knees costing a sharp cry of pain that he immediately stifled. The industrial hum of the Thalrek intensified again, the deep thrum of the gravitational generators preparing to engage the incoming threat. He needed leverage. Using his left shoulder, the one less damaged, he shoved himself against the wall, finding the smallest purchase with his bare feet on the polished floor. Inch by agonizing inch, he began to climb the cold, seamless obsidian wall, relying purely on friction and desperate will. He wasn't climbing to save himself. He was climbing to be inconvenient. When his fingers finally brushed the edge of the maintenance port, he felt a powerful, grinding tremor tear through the Thalrek's hull. The massive ship had engaged its weapons system, preparing to meet the illogical rush of Marwan Pike. He grabbed the shard of metal from the port, his fingers closing around the cold, razor-sharp edge. He didn't care about the blood running down his palm. He reached the pressure release, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. He slotted the metal shard into the minuscule seam of the environmental seal. 9 minutes until intersection. With a final, desperate heave, Zoran applied maximum pressure to the shard, attempting to pry open the seal. The tiny mechanism resisted, screeching under the stress. And then, the high-pitched electrical hum of the Thalrek suddenly cut out, replaced by a deep, urgent, and angry alarm. The cylindrical compartment was plunged into emergency crimson lighting. Zoran froze, body plastered against the cold wall. A deep, non-translated voice boomed through the ship's internal comm system, a sound of immense authority and fury. The Silos had noticed the intrusion. Not the physical short circuit, but the momentary, minuscule deviation in the atmospheric pressure curve caused by Zoran's desperate attempt. They had prioritized the internal breach over the external engagement. Zoran hung there, suspended in the flashing red light, the metal shard still firmly lodged in the seal. He was fully exposed, trapped, and had just signaled his position to the most dangerous ship in the quadrant, just as Pike was about to arrive. He didn't have time to finish the bypass. He didn't have time to retreat. He only had time for the inevitable consequence. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The deep, authoritative boom of the Silos command voice was not meant for Zoran's comprehension, but for his absolute compliance. It was a wave of pure acoustic dominance, paralyzing in its force. The crimson light pulsed violently, highlighting the fact that Zoran, clinging to the cold wall 3 meters up, was the primary threat variable. 8 minutes until intersection. Zoran ignored the noise, focusing instead on the hot, desperate slickness of his own blood running over the optical relay shard in his hand. He wasn't trying to finish the short circuit perfectly. Perfection had gotten him here. He was aiming for a catastrophic failure of the seal's structural integrity. He twisted the shard, leveraging his full body weight against the metal. The maintenance port shrieked in protest, a sound that sliced through the high-frequency ship alarm. Immediately, a thin silver tendril erupted from the ceiling above the access port. It wasn't a weapon. It was a repair drone, swift and silent, dedicated solely to reversing Zoran's damage. The Silos system, driven by logic, prioritized the repair of the newly introduced flaw before engaging the inbound hostile vessel. Zoran roared, a ragged, painful sound that felt more like a cough, and shoved the shard with his entire shoulder. His ribs screamed, sending a blinding flash of white pain behind his eyes. He didn't see the drone. He just felt the impact of its metallic appendage striking his left thigh, a blunt, stunning blow designed to incapacitate the biological intruder without damaging the high-precision mechanism. The shard snapped. For a terrifying second, Zoran thought he had failed. He felt the silver drone beginning to spray a self-sealing polymer over the compromised seal. But the final desperate twist had been enough. The environmental seal, fatally stressed, blew. Not with an explosion, but a localized, violent jet of superheated, filtered air that instantly pressurized the interior circuitry. The resulting thermal surge wasn't modeled for containment. The obsidian wall around the port erupted in a dazzling shower of blue-white electrical sparks. The repair drone, caught in the microblast, instantly seized up, crashing in a smoking heap onto the deck plates far below. The air in the compartment instantly began to smell of ozone and burning synthetic polymer, the beautiful, chaotic scent of an engineer's mistake finally paying off. Zoran dropped, falling the 3 meters. He landed awkwardly, rolling to break the impact, his already bruised back hitting the deck with punishing finality. He lay there gasping, trying to understand what the silence meant. The Silos command voice was gone. The internal crimson alarms were replaced by a furious, high-pitched rapid cycling of safety tones. "Target integrity breach confirmed," a cold, synthesized voice declared, translating instantly across the Thalrek's internal speakers. "Prioritizing external hull magnetic stabilization failure, activating external contingency lockdown." Zoran lifted his head. His gambit had worked. The localized pressure shockwave, traveling through the ship's internal conduits, had momentarily overloaded the magnetic locking sequences securing the Seeker-1 wreckage to the Thalrek's outer hull. But the Silos were fast. Their contingency lockdown was already engaging, attempting to re-establish the magnetic field before the wreckage drifted into the gravity well. Zoran needed one thing more. He crawled, ignoring the searing pain in his chest, toward the small recessed port containing his debris. He found the tattered remains of the Seeker-1's memory core. The housing was still largely intact. The core contained a low-power backup battery, meant only to maintain 5 minutes of data buffering, but it was enough to power the transponder he had exposed. 6 minutes until intersection. He snatched the core, scraping his bloody hand against the obsidian. The cylindrical compartment suddenly shuddered violently, the floor dropping slightly under his weight. This was the Thalrek maneuvering. Zoran knew that movement. The Silos were adjusting their optimal attack vector, locking their weapons onto the Seeker-1 wreckage. They weren't targeting Pike's incoming ship. They were eliminating the chaotic variable, intending to vaporize the debris field before the primary engagement. He was pinned between the floor and the wall as the ship compensated for the aggressive turn. He forced the shattered memory core open, exposing the tiny green emergency contact strip. He needed to touch that strip to a conductive surface to trigger the transponder pulse. The obsidian floor would not work. His sweaty, bloody thumb would not work. He needed the thermos. He reached desperately for the dented metallic thermos, which had rolled near the wall after he fell. It was the only uncompromised piece of metal in the cell. Just as his fingers brushed the cold surface, a sharp crack echoed from the wall next to him. A small, high-velocity projectile, a dense block of compressed foam designed to stun and neutralize, smashed into the wall a centimeter from his head. The Silos had moved past repair to physical incapacitation. Zoran pulled the thermos to him. He was too slow. Another shot. This one hit his elbow, stunning the arm and forcing a choked cry past his lips. His arm fell uselessly. 4 minutes. He used his undamaged right hand, slamming the exposed green contact strip of the memory core against the metallic thermos. Nothing. The connection was too unstable. He shifted his grip, using the cold metal of the thermos as a wedge, forcing the memory core contacts into place. He closed his eyes, concentrating purely on the slight electrical heat blooming in his palm. 3 minutes. Then, a faint, high-frequency pulse emanated from the memory core. The tiny transponder was active. He threw the thermos and the core across the compartment toward the electrical sparks near the now compromised maintenance port. He didn't need to eject it perfectly. He needed the internal turbulence and the short-circuiting electrical field to provide the final kick. The core and thermos slid across the floor, coming to rest exactly beneath the sparking port. The high heat from the exposed circuits made the memory core's already stressed backup battery detonate. Not in a large blast, but a sharp, concussive pop. The explosion, localized but powerful, drove the remnants of the Seeker-1 memory core outward through the already compromised maintenance port and into the Thalrek's exterior hull plating, where it was caught in the last desperate magnetic field decay. The effect was instantaneous and deafening. A high-pitched crack reverberated through the hull, followed by the sickening grating sound of metal tearing against metal. Outside the ship, the Seeker-1 transponder, now a tiny speck broadcasting maximal contact data, had successfully detached from the Thalrek and was tumbling wildly into the gravity field. The Psylos ship responded with overwhelming force. Massive energy banks fired, but they weren't aimed at Pike's inbound vessel. They were aimed at the point source of the chaotic debris, the ejected transponder, the Seeker-1 wreckage, and the section of space where the gravity well was deepest. For a full 10 seconds, the Thalrek hammered the empty space Zoran's chaotic beacon had drifted toward. The resulting shockwaves inside Zoran's containment cell were physically agonizing. The obsidian walls, designed for perfect containment, stressed and groaned. Then came the second, more profound consequence. The Thalrek's internal systems, compensating for the unexpected loss of external mass and dealing with the internal chaos Zoran had created, suffered a massive power failure. The crimson lights went dark, and the cylindrical cell plunged into absolute, suffocating blackness. When the emergency backup lights flickered on, a weak, flickering yellow, Zoran saw the damage. The entire section of wall surrounding the maintenance port was ruptured, twisted inward and outward simultaneously, a ragged hole leading into the ship's primary ventilation and cable conduit. The external engagement was over. The silence that followed the deep, continuous thrum of the Psylos weapons was heavy, charged with residual power. Zoran pulled himself onto his knees, crawling toward the jagged hole. He looked out into the main conduit, a narrow, dark canyon filled with thick power cables, hissing coolant pipes, and the thick, oily smell of burning electronics. He had bought the moment of chaos. Was it enough? The main comms panel in the corridor flickered back to life, overloaded and sputtering. Zoran dragged himself closer, listening with painful intensity. Acknowledged. Thalrek, command. A voice snapped through the static, cold and precise, carrying the absolute conviction of perfect protocol. It was Marwyn Pike. Threat assessment updated. Collision risk neutralized. Executing minimum defensive maneuver Beta 3 Prime. Targeting Thalrek gravity generation manifold, predicted vulnerability point based on observed stress parameters. Zoran sagged against the torn metal edge of the compartment. She had done it. Zoran's chaos, the ejected transponder, and the immediate powerful reaction by the Psylos fleet had consumed the Psylos's engagement window, forcing them to divert massive firepower to neutralize the debris field. Pike, armed with the assumption that the Psylos would now expect the chaotic move, had executed the single, most logical maneuver, hitting the Thalrek at a point of vulnerability that the aliens hadn't had time to secure. Zoran had used his failure to force Pike's competence to succeed. The entire Thalrek suddenly roared, a sound of unimaginable stress and internal collapse. Pike had hit her target. The gravity generator manifold, the very system that created the localized gravity well trapping them, had been severely damaged. The ship lurched violently, throwing Zoran against the conduit wall. The pressure was lifting. The crushing, artificial weight of the localized field was dissipating rapidly. Pike was forcing an exit. As the ship tore itself free from the gravity well, Zoran saw something flicker on a nearby emergency terminal embedded in the conduit wall. It wasn't the Silos system. It was a familiar, if severely fragmented, data stream, a ghost in the machine. Zoran pushed past the pane and touched the terminal. The screen stabilized, showing a line of text. Zoran. Residual data recovery 76%. System integration incomplete. Recommend immediate egress. That was unnecessary flamboyance. Vela. He was back, but fractured, reduced to a low-level subroutine running on the Thalrek's compromised external access grid. Good to hear your voice, Vela, Zoran managed, leaning his head against the cool metal of the terminal. Just trying to keep things interesting for Pike. Officer Pike is currently attempting warp jump initiation, Vela reported dryly. She is utilizing 75% maximum thrust in a non-stabilized field, highly inefficient. However, she appears to have survived your rescue attempt. A victory for protocol, then? Zoran sighed, closing his eyes. The immediate threat was gone. Pike was escaping, alive and disciplined. The system had survived. He looked around the conduit. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of vaporized circuits. He was free of his cell, but he was trapped deep inside a furious, crippled alien warship, severely wounded, far from any escape pod, and the Silos were rapidly regaining control. He ran his hand over his bruised chest, feeling the ragged breath catch in his throat. He had saved Pike, the person who had meticulously documented his ruin and was sent here to enforce his destruction. He had done it by destroying everything around him. The residual hum of the Silos systems began to rise again, higher and sharper this time, not in confusion, but in methodical, calculated rage. The internal pursuit protocols were activating. They were no longer searching for a chaotic anomaly. They were hunting a calculated threat, and Zoran had just become their primary objective. Vela, Zoran whispered, pulling himself to his feet, using the thick, sparking conduit cable for support. Pike got away with the truth. What's our exit strategy from deep space on a disabled alien ship? Analysis indicates probability of successful long-term survival is statistically 0.0001%, Vela replied, regaining its default emotionless tone. So you're telling me there's a chance, Zoran repeated, grabbing a length of shredded copper cable that felt reassuringly solid in his hand. He took a ragged, burning breath of the toxic air. He was still the unpredictable factor, a ghost moving through the veins of a wounded giant, and now he was armed with a copper wire and the broken ghost of his AI. The war was over, but the consequence was just beginning. The ship settled. The violent, bone-jarring lurch that signaled Pike's successful warp jump dissipated into a low, pervasive groan of protesting metal. The Thalrek was not happy, but it was stabilized. The deep, continuous thrum of the alien engines had been replaced by an intermittent, wheezing sigh of damaged infrastructure, like a giant holding its breath. The silence was the worst part. It pressed in on Zoran in the narrow conduit, cold and heavy. He coughed, the ragged sound echoing off the cracked conduit walls, and spat a mouthful of metallic-tasting blood onto the cable housing. Vela, define regaining control, Zoran rasped, pulling his torso out of the jagged hole and leaning back against a massive, dark coolant pipe. His left arm was useless, numb from the impact, and the pain in his ribs made every shallow breath an active negotiation. The Silos command structure has localized your position to this conduit junction, Zoran, Vela replied, the fragmented voice now barely a whisper inside the emergency terminal. They are no longer using generalized search protocols. They are accessing the schematics of this hull section and calculating the most efficient way to achieve immediate neutralization of the human entity. Estimated time to contact, 4 minutes. That's fast, Zoran noted, trying to flex the fingers of his good hand. It is logical. You forced their hand. You compromised the gravity generator and allowed the escape of Officer Pike. Their response is now highly predictable. Overwhelming force applied to the point of origin of the chaos. Congratulations. You are now categorized as an essential threat. Zoran managed a weak, tired smile. Just me. No capital ships, no backup. Just a tired man with a copper wire. He closed his eyes, inhaling the thick, acidic air. He knew what 4 minutes meant inside this machine. The Silos wouldn't send drones. They would simply pressurize the conduit or send a directional plasma surge down the line. Pike is safe, though. The data is safe. Affirmative, Vila confirmed. Officer Pike executed an exemplary tactical maneuver utilizing the cover of the residual debris field, which you created, to jump. She will return the acquired data from the Seeker-1 core and your station's logs, confirming the Silos threat model. She will likely be promoted. You, Zoran, will be recorded as a criminal who died trying to destroy classified information. Wouldn't have it any other way. Zoran sighed. The irony was so dense it was almost physically palpable. He had saved the entire sector by proving the system was wrong, and the system would bury him to keep the rules intact. He reached up, dragging his functioning hand across the cool metal pipe. His fingers brushed against something familiar caught in the tangled mess of ruptured cables. A smooth metallic cylinder. The thermos. It was dented, scorched, and covered in grime, but intact. He carefully retrieved it. He held the thermal container, its surface now cold, a tangible, absurd anchor to his old life. In that life, he was a nuisance, a pilot who occasionally spilled his synth tea on the controls, causing minor financial damage while trying to preserve a doomed, chaotic station. In this moment, he was a ghost, having leveraged that thermos, that pathetic piece of personal property, to destroy a hyper-advanced alien warship's tactical efficiency. He opened the thermos. It was empty. The synth tea had long since spilled out, a messy, sticky layer coating the original cockpit floor back on the station. That tacky feeling, the coppery taste of fear and adrenaline, the small, immediate need to clean the mess. That was all long gone now. The man who spilled tea on the console was dead. The man who remained was just the residue. Zoran looked down at the copper cable in his lap. He had grabbed it instinctively as a makeshift weapon or tool, but now it seemed pointless. Survival was 0.0001%. It wasn't about fighting anymore. It was about choosing the final exit. He felt the first physical manifestation of the Silos closing in. A high-frequency vibration, a low-grade tremor, began to ripple through the deck plating beneath him. Not the chaotic thrum of stress, but the focused, methodical tremor of a machine preparing to purge a contaminant. It was the same sound he'd heard when the Silos first tried to vaporize his station. The sound of inevitability. He looked around the darkened conduit at the heavy cost of his small, improbable victory. Pike had the data. The truth was safe. He had lost everything else, including any chance of a clean slate. His penance for the Thalassa incident had been paid in full, just not in a way anyone would ever acknowledge. He reached into his pocket and, with extreme difficulty, pulled out the microfiber cloth he used to clean the controls. It was soaked with blood, oil, and dust. He gently wiped the side of the dented thermos, even though the effort cost him a searing jolt of pain in his ribs. A final, small act of maintenance. The tremor intensified. He heard the faint hiss of pressure valves cycling somewhere down the dark corridor. Zoran leaned his head back against the pipe, feeling the slow, rhythmic pounding of his exhausted heart. He closed his eyes, holding the clean side of the thermos tight against his chest. "Vila," Zoran whispered, his voice thin, almost lost in the rising sound of the ship. The probability of successful evasion? 0.0001% remains constant. Zoran nodded, accepting the answer. The odds had always been terrible. The only thing that had changed was that this time he was ready for them. Then I guess I'm relieved of duty. Permanently, Zoran said, waiting for the hiss to become a roar. Tell Jorin Blackwell his quarterly equipment report is going to be a real mess. He listened to the machine coming for him, not in panic, but with a strange, profound quietness. He wasn't afraid of the logic anymore. The thrumming intensified, promising not structural failure, but finality. I should have just stayed home and drunk the synth tea. This was exhausting. He finally stopped scrubbing the console. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.